All right, so in this next video, we're going to go over the protocol of this experiment step by step. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, and right here is the protocol that I've written out. You also have the protocol in your lab manual. But I like to write out my own because that really, I try to help give as much resources as I can for you guys. And this is a second resource that you guys can look over and then use your lab manual as well. And so let's first and foremost look at the purpose of this experiment, or the goal of this experiment, which is highlighted right here. So this experiment will test the effects of different light cycles on the Manduca hornworm's growth. So essentially, what we're going to be doing is manipulating that circadian rhythm that we talked about previously by adding different conditions of light to different hornworms. So one hornworm will get more exposure to light, while the second one will get less exposure to light and therefore more exposure to dark, right? And the last hornworm will get a 50-50, right? It'll get exactly even amounts of light and dark conditions. And what we want to see is, if we do this manipulation, what effect does it have on our organisms, growth, activity, all just overall life, right? So the way we can do that and collect data is specifically looking at growth. So are they growing slower? Let's look at their life cycle. Are they going into the next phase quicker or slower compared to the control, right? So this is really your purpose of your experiment right here, which is, as always, really important to notate in your lab report. Like I say, you got to have a statement, a goal statement. The purpose of this experiment was yada, 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 or the goal of this experiment is to examine, so forth, right? So make sure you put those goal statements into your lab report. And moving on, these are the different materials that you'll need for this experiment, but I'm just going to touch base back on them when I go step by step in the protocol. But, just generally, you're going to need 3 hornworms. You're going to need 3 containers for them to live in. One container per worm. You're going to need 15 grams of food to start off with, because you'll always feed these worms 5 grams each. You'll need a scale to weigh them daily, and you'll need your different light boxes. So the light boxes are these little cubes, right? They have a light bulb in there. This is kind of like my representation of a light bulb. And it's set up to these timers, and these timers are allowing for certain conditions, whatever you set them up to be. So if you set the condition to be a light box, representing, more light hours, then you might, sorry about that. So essentially, you can set up these settings to represent which condition you want. So if it's the light condition, you could set up the timer to have the light bulb on for 18 hours of light, and then shut off for 6 hours of darkness, essentially. And another box would be used to represent your dark condition. So you would set up the light bulb, you would set up the timer to have 18 hours of darkness, and then the light bulb to turn on for 6 hours of the light. So that's quite a difference in light hours, right? Only 6 hours of light. The majority of the day, 18 hours of the day, will be a dark condition. And the third condition is a 50-50, right? So 12 hours in the light with the light bulb on, and then the timer will shut off, and then you'll have 12 hours in the dark for the worms to live in. So those are your 3 conditions, and of 3 different light boxes for 3 different worms that you have for this experiment. But let's go over the experiment step by step, since those are all your materials. So what you would want to start off with is, just like with the bacterial project, you want to define your components of the experiment. You want to consider what are your variables, what are your controls, how are you going to standardize your experiment, um, and you want to create your hypothesis, and you want to determine how you'll quantify your data. So you want to always start off a protocol by having a really great discussion with your group, if it's group work, or with yourself, if it's an individual experiment. So before you even start grabbing worms or anything like that, I would have had you guys talk in your group and define these components. I would have gone through each table, and I would have wanted your answers. What are your variables? And the variables here in this experiment are light and dark and your control, but more than that, it is, your dependent becomes growth, right? So I should probably add that in. Growth. So your dependent becomes growth, meaning that over time, and depending on which light or dark condition, there's a certain growth that happens in that organism. And that's what we're going to be looking at, right? And then knowing your controls. So obviously the main control of the experiment is the 50-50 worm, where the worm is exposed to 12 hours of dark and 12 hours of light. But more than that, different steps you can take to kind of standardize your experiment is that you're going to be grabbing the same size worms, right? For if you were to have started with 2 small worms and 1 large worm, you're already biasing your experiment because the larger worm is already starting at a higher growth, right? So picking out worms that have very similar sizes helps to alleviate any biasness that you have, right? You'll feed them all the same amount of food. This is, you always feed them 5 grams or like 5 to 10 grams, but regardless, they'll all have the same amount of food. So that way, that one didn't starve and that's why it has lower growth, or one didn't get overfed and that's why it has a lot of growth. The growth happened because of your different light conditions. And they all should relatively get the same care. So you'll clean out their cages, you won't allow for any fungi, they won't get sick. You check on them relatively around the same time of day. All these steps help to standardize your experiment. You can't say that one worm had more growth than the other because it ate more or it ate less, or I forgot about that worm and I never really took care of it, so yeah, it didn't grow much. So all these steps help standardize your experiment, and that relates back to how you control your experiment. You would have to create a hypothesis, so I'm going to leave this up to you, but remember we talked about a null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis, so make sure you discuss that in your groups. What would be your null hypothesis and your alternative hypothesis here? Null would be no change, right? So there was no really any difference between all 3 groups, they're all the same. Our alternative would be something like, the light experienced more growth or the dark experienced more growth than the control group, right? You always want to compare these variables to the control and not necessarily to one another. If you're going to claim that the light worm, the worm that was held in the more light activity, right? If you're going to claim that it was growing more, it was growing bigger than the other worms, you need to relate it back to the control worm. The light worm was larger than the control, meaning that the light grew faster due to its more light hours activities, right? So the next step would be to determine how to quantify your data. Maybe you want to take average growth over time of each worm. Maybe you want to represent how much food they ate and how frequently they ate over histograms. Maybe you want to represent a bar chart or a line graph that shows the growth over time. Anything like this is really crucial for your lab report results. But again, it's important to take this into consideration in step number 1, right? To talk about this with your group. How am I going to determine my data? What's my hypothesis going to be? What are my variables? What are my controls? Defining all these components before you even start the experiment, right? So that you're already on the right track. So the second main step is to practice aseptic technique. So we already talked about this, how this is important for good care of the worms because, they're really prone to infections or anything like that, and fungi growth, things like that. But it's also important for yourself because you are protecting yourself from any kind of, anything that you don't want, so that way you're wearing gloves and protecting your hands and protecting yourself, right? But I always kind of tell the students, be careful and be gentle with the worms. Like, they're pretty sturdy. You can handle them pretty well. You're not going to squish them, but they are our animals. So we do, as scientists, it's really, really important to respect our models and to treat them with care, right? So after you've defined your components and you're all good with aseptic technique, then you would move on to the main part of the experiment, right? So how do you collect your data? What are you going to do with these worms? So first, you choose 3 worms of similar size. You take 1 worm at a time because these things are creepy crawlies. They will move around, and then after you've weighed one, you'd be like, wait, which one did I just weigh, right? So you'll take one and you'll go ahead and name it. And I get some crazy names throughout the semesters. It's pretty fun. But let's just say, Mary, Jill, and Jack. So we take Mary by herself and we get her container, just 1 container, and we label it, Mary, and she's going to be our light condition. So she will be exposed to more light hours. She will be exposed to 18 hours of light. And you would label all that information onto the container, as well as like Sarah as my TA, group number 3, we are Monday 2:00 class, right? So you would label it all and take your worm and name them. And after you've named the worm, you would use a scale to weigh the worm, right? So let's say you got 3 grams for the very first day, and you'd write that in a log. Now there is a log inside your lab manual. It looks like I'm not sure what page it is. I want to say like 68 or something like that. But that you can follow along. But since we're actually doing an online class, I'm going to post my own log for you guys that you guys will use, since you guys aren't actually collecting your data, right? So you would take the first worm, you would weigh him, and you would write that 3 grams into your log. And essentially it'll be a column that has, Mary worm 1 under light conditions, and then a row that says, day 1's weight was 3 grams. Day 1's feeding was 5 grams of food. And then it's day 1, so there's no leftover food. This is the very first day. So that's the kind of data that you'd be collecting and writing into your log. You'd place Mary into her container that's been labeled, and you would add 5 grams of food into her container, so that way she's, has food for the day. And then you'd repeat these steps for the other 2 worms. So you'd get the second container, you'd label it, Jack, and you'd write that he's going to be in the dark condition. And you would put, Sarah is my TA, I'm her Monday at 2:00 class, and I'm group 3. And then you would weigh, Jack the worm. You would put this into your data log, maybe he's 3.5 or 3.2 grams, if he's 3.2 grams, you put that into your data log, and then you place him into his own container, and you move on to the third worm. Let's say, name him Jill. You label his container accordingly, and you weigh him. Let's say that he's 3.3 grams. You put that into your log, and you place him into his container, right? So now you have Mary, Jack, and Jill all into their worms. You have each one labeled with their name, with which group number you are, and which condition they represent, light, dark, or control. And you lastly would place your worms into each of the light boxes, and notate which worm was placed in which condition. So if Mary's supposed to go into the light box, you need to write that down like a million times so you don't forget. And you place her into the light box that represents a light condition. So the light box that has 18 hours of light and 6 hours of dark, you place Mary into. And then you'd get Jack and make sure everything's notated on him. He represents my dark box. He represents my dark condition. I'm going to put him into the dark box, which has 18 hours of darkness and 6 hours of lightness. You want to make note of that. You want to make sure that you know that he goes into that condition. And let's say Jill is our control worm. So you grab his containers and you put that container into the control box, which has 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark. And now you have each worm inside their little containers with food, and you have each of those containers into the light box that it goes into accordingly. So after you have set up basically your experiment, you'd go back and you'd clean up your area. You'd wipe down with ethanol, and you spray it down with ethanol and wipe it down, because again, keeping everything clean is really essential in this lab. You make sure all your materials are put away, like your scale and things like that. And then you'd continue so that for the next 10 or 12 days. So the next day, let's say you were in my Monday class, you would need to come in on Tuesday and then Wednesday and then Thursday and Friday. But let's say you came in on Tuesday as your day 2, you would need to repeat these steps up here. You'd grab one worm at a time. So again, if you grabbed all 3, then they'd get confusing, go, wait, which worm is which? Just grab Mary, you take her weight, you would clean out the container, there's probably some worm poop in there, and you would weigh the leftover food. Now this leftover food will represent how much she ate, right? So let's say you fed her 5 grams and there's only 1 gram left. You can tell that Mary ate 4 grams in a matter of 24 hours. So this is more data that you can collect. And when you're growing, you tend to eat a lot, right? So that correlates to your experiment. And you can also create a line graph or a bar chart or a histogram based on how much food was eaten or how much food was left over. And then you would weigh Mary to see what her growth was, right? So if she started off at 3.2, maybe today she's 3.6, she grew 0.3 grams in 24 hours. So you would tackle this kind of data as well. And then after cleaning up her cage and setting her up with new food, so if she has 1 gram left, you would add 4 more grams into there the second day, so that way she always has at least 5 grams of food. If she ate all 5 grams, you might want to consider giving her 7 grams because she's really hungry in that case, right? So you're always allowed to give 5 to 10 grams, max 10 grams. I don't think they ever really eat more than 10 grams, but just depending on how active they are. So in the very beginning, they eat a lot, so it's somewhere around 5 to 10, but you need to make sure that you've standardized this along all 3 worms. So if you're giving Mary 7 grams, you got to give like Jack and Jill 7 grams as well. So that way no one can say that the growth happened because Mary got more food, right? More than that, on the second day, you would clean up everything and you would put them back into their conditions that they belong to. So you never want to put back Mary into the dark box or Mary into the control group, because Mary represented your light box, your light condition. And this tends to happen a lot in this experiment where things get mixed around. So the more labeling you have and the more the more you've noted which worm goes to what, and really naming those worms really help in keeping this controlled. So you'd put them back in their homes, in their little light boxes, and you'd write your data, and you'd come the next day and do the same thing. And you would do this for about 10 to 12 days, or whenever the worms start going into their cocoons. So they will start developing in their cocoons along the 10th or 12th day, and after that, they won't really eat any more food, so there's no need to come in and feed them, and we'll we'll dispose of them. And that leads us to the end of our experiment. After the 10 days, the 10 to 12 days, and you've gathered up the data and you've really taken care of them on a daily basis and you weighed them on a daily basis, then we would come in and we would take the final weight, and then you would hand over your 3 worms to me, my TA, right, your TA, and I would dispose of them into a compost that we have. So they're really happy, you know, before they meet their maker kind of deal. They go into this nice compost, it's nice soil for them to just kind of go into their cocoon. And after, you know, it takes weeks for them to fully develop into the moth phase, but so you won't get to see that, but that's what happens there. And then you would go back and you would clean all the containers you used over this experiment with dish soap in the sink, and then you would sanitize them with ethanol spray so that way we can use them next semester, right? Cleanup is always on you guys. And then you would talk with your group on your approach for lab report 2. So by now you would have had a extensive background done, you would have your methods done. Now let's talk about results. Let's analyze this data that we've collected over the last 10 to 12 days, and let's have a discussion so that way we know what to write for in the conclusion of our lab report 2. So I think that this protocol is really laid out step by step, but if you have any questions about the experiment and what exactly was done, go ahead and email me, no problem, I'll get back to you guys. And really that ends this lab right here. That would be the end of lab 6. So I'll see you guys next time.